Okay, all right. I hope you're going to be able to see. Thank you very much. It's lovely to see all of you here this evening. And to give a very brief introduction to this book. And I hope you're going to be able to see these slides, but anyway, you'll get the general gist. So why did I write it? Well, I wrote it because I was doing a piece of work for a large international panel on biodiversity ecosystem services. And my role in this, I was leading one of the chapters, was to find the evidence base about the link between nature and human health. And I kept coming across this paper that was published in Science in 1984. And in it, they said that they looked at patients who had gallbladder operations, and they looked at the view they had from the hospital window. So half the patients looked onto these trees, and the other patients looked onto the brick wall. And they looked at recovery rates and the number of painkillers these people took. And what they found was that the patients who could see the vegetation from their hospital window bed went home sooner after the operation, they took fewer painkillers, and they were less negative and upset when they were in hospital. Now, to me, this was like, what's going on? I'm quite a cynical scientist. I wanted to kick the tires because there is someone lying in a hospital bed looking at vegetation, and yet they're getting a statistically significant result from just looking at the vegetation. And so that really started a whole journey for me. But it wasn't just that, it was also coming across a number of these population level studies. Now remember, these are correlations, they're not actually telling what's going on, but this is one of my favorite ones. It was published in The Lancet, so one of our top medical science journals in the world. And they looked at a 10-year set of data, and they geolocated where everyone lived, and they looked at their medical records for common mental illnesses. And the population size, 2.3 million adults. So this is not a small little sample size. And what did they find? Well, they found that the people that live closer to the green space had much lower odds of common mental diseases. And they threw every statistic package at this to make sure this was robust. It was very, very robust, this data. And for every 360 meters, I mean, it's an incredible number. Every 360 meters they moved further away, they had a higher occurrence of common mental diseases. Now, people will say, oh, that's to do with people who are richer, live in greener areas. Well, that is absolutely not what they found. They found that the positive effects of green space were more enhanced in socioeconomically deprived areas. And it's not just mental diseases. There's many, many studies that have come out showing the same for physical diseases as well. So this is Toronto. And the beauty of Toronto is that every single tree in the city is mapped. So they can then again do the same thing, map the trees against the health records of the people who live in the area. They've got a smaller sample there, about 30,000 people, still pretty big, and found that people who lived in streets with more trees had significantly less cardiometabolic conditions. And also they were significantly happier. So again, these are really, really big population level, and there are so many of these coming through now where they're showing this link. So the question is, what on earth's going on? What are the mechanisms of action in the body that are bringing about the positive outcomes? Is it just that we see and feel better, or are there really things going on? And that is what I set out to try and do in this book. And another question, we've got many things now, this government and international governments are saying every citizen should be within 15 minutes walking distance of green space. It's quite clearly in the environment policy for the UK, but also we signed up to the Conference of Parties in 2023 saying that we as a country would abide with this. But is all green space equal? So if I walk from my place where I work in Oxford, I've got the Botanic Gardens, very nice. I also have a football pitch, that's my dog for scale. I have the university parks, I have the Cutterslow Community Forest, and I have a wooded area near the university parks. So the question is, are there particular aspects of nature and our interaction with nature that bring about better health outcomes than other aspects. So can we drill down and really understand what's going on? And that's where my journey really started. And also, if you are housebound, does this mean that you can't have these benefits? Or what about nature indoors? Because of course the whole concept of nature, of forest bathing, is fantastic if you've got 2 hours to go and lie in a forest. But most of us, and I'm sure I'm seeing the nods around the room, will be the same. It's a fantastic concept and it does work, and certainly prescribing nature is an important thing in Japan, especially in Tokyo. But what about indoors? Can you get these benefits from small things that you do indoors? So the way I split the work down was actually based on the papers. What I came across when I started looking at what's the evidence base, most of these studies have been published in medical journals or psychiatry journals, not in your usual, my usual biology journals or geography journals. And it's very much about the senses. It's about the different senses and how our different senses interact with nature. And I call them green senses. And there are 5 different senses we have, and actually all of them have a significant and very distinctive interactions with health. So the first one is to do with our sight. So think back to the hospital window bed. The second one is to do with smell, and much a scent the thing we often don't think about, and yet really important. Sound, touch, and taste. Now, taste, it's not so much the taste as it's the swallowing and ingesting the environmental microbiome that we find in more biodiverse environments. So for the next 15 minutes, I'm just going to go through some of the evidence base, which I hope will then lead into discussion around this. So it just gives you a flavour of some of the things, but I actually cannot give you the whole book, but I hope it gives you some ideas. So let's start off with sight then. So this is a really simple experiment. And if ever this made me do something, it made me change my computer screen. Because these women, who are the participants, they just look for 90 seconds at either trees or at an urban screenshot. And they measured their heart rate variability, their brain activity, and a psychological well-being index, all done in a clinical environment. And what did they show? So this is just 90 seconds we've got here of time. And this is a measure of its blood flow to a part of the brain, which when you get a decrease in the blood flow, you are more physiologically calm. And this is the little stars on there indicate the statistical significance. Very strong result that just looking at the forest screens saver rather than the urban one, you are psychologically calmer in 90 seconds. And on the other side is a psychological measurement. You can see they were very comfortable, much more comfortable by looking at the trees than looking at the urban landscape. But what is it about it? Is it the colour or is it the shape? Now, colour is an interesting one. And this is a lovely experiment which was carried out where they wired up people, but they showed them, this is the ivy leaf, the heterohelix, great plant to use because it's very it hybridizes really easily. So you have many different colored leaves. And then they looked at these 5 different colours. They showed them a tray with each of the colours as they went through, and they measured the brain activity and also the eye movements, how often the eye fixated on particular colours, and again, psychological well-being indexes. And again, effectively, it was bright yellow. It's green, yellow, and bright green were the most effective at leading to relaxation, a psychological relaxation, a mechanism of action. It was the green, yellow, and the bright green leaves that showed the highest eye fixation rate. And actually the green and white and the green were the preferred in subjective assessments. Now, this was across many different cultures, so it's not a cultural thing, it's an automatic thing that's going on. So we might have preferences for particular colours, but actually what goes on inside automatically is different. But the really interesting thing about this one at the end is that the one that made everyone most cross was red. So you think about Christmas and poinsettia on your Christmas table and anyway. Okay, but what about shape? So when you look at a horizon, what happens is you look at the overall shape, but what they've shown is our eyes are then tracing the fractal dimension of the horizon. So what does that mean? It means the number of times that shape effectively divides into itself and into itself and into itself. So if it keeps going on into infinity, it'll have a fractional dimension of 2, and if none at all, it has the other end in terms of fractional dimension. But the point I want to make here is that nature has a lot of fractional dimensions in it. So think of a tree and think of a branch structure of a tree, and then within that you have a smaller structure and a smaller structure and a smaller structure. So why am I saying this? Well, horizons also have fractional dimensions to them. So if you see in here, you look at the coniferous forest there, it's sort of up and down, up and down. It has a fractional dimension of 1.5. So it's getting closer to having a lot of replication. Savanna landscape, 1.3, a few scattered trees on an open landscape. Fractional dimension of a city, you get down to 1.2. So when they looked at people's reaction, when they looked at different fractional dimensions, they were looking at their brainwave activity to see whether or not you get changes depending on the fractional dimension. And they got these participants to look at 4 pictures, and then they measured, while they did it, they looked at their brainwave activities. Let me just show these pictures. So just look at these 4 pictures. So these are computer-generated fractal horizons. So imagine this is a horizon of a landscape. So put up your hand if you like A best. Put up your hand if you like B best. Put up your hand if you like C best. And put up your hand if you like D best. Right, there's one D. Okay, let me just show you what these are. 1.14. So this was the second most popular. 1.32 is the most popular. 1.51, a few of you, and then one person put up for D. What did they find? Well, when they looked at these forward fractal dimensions, what they found is the one that induced the largest positive changes in brainwave activity was 1.32. And they found this, you get this heightened alpha frequency, which is associated with increased wakefulness. They had a reduced delta frequency, so you're less sleepy, and also you have an increased external focus. So what shaped landscape is that? The one that makes you most relaxed and most focused? It's this one, the savanna landscape. Think about Capability Brown. Think about pictures of landscapes on photos on the walls, on pictures. Now, there's a whole theory that we have a deep evolutionary eco-evolutionary reason for this. It's a sort of an out of Africa approach. I mean, there's 2 sides to this. I don't get involved in that. Oh, hang on. What have I done here? Can someone help me on this? I need to go back to, how do I get? Sorry, so I've pressed something terrible. Oh, one moment, we can just need to go back to the slideshow. Slideshow. Maybe go on the corner. View. That's it. Oh, right, let me just zoom through it. I won't touch this thing. I'll get right, okay. But I was going to, so think about Capability Brown, think about designs of landscapes, and think about the ones that we automatically tend to most like to go in. And there seems to be a very good link there, regardless of whether or not it's deep in our inset. This is the one that brings about the most positive outcomes, certainly in our brainwave activity. But let's move on to smell. So we'll probably be all of us be recognise the most sort of common smells like lemon, limonene, and also the pinus, the pine smells. But what they've shown actually with smell is that this is a really unknown sense, but it can be really very, very important for our health. And so this is what they've done in the lab here. This is a funnel here. You won't be able to see it in front of her nose. But when they puff out the smell here of limonene, what they found very, very quickly, again, within 90 seconds, you get a really big difference in heart rate variability. And the parasympathetic heart rate variability is enhanced. And this is one that's enhanced when you're more relaxed. The heart rate goes slower. and people were much, much more comfortable smelling D-limonene. And the really interesting thing is, when you think about smell, I think I used to think you smell, taking a smell, you just breathe it out again. But smell is one of those aspects of nature where nature comes into your body, because when you smell that smell, it passes across your lung membrane into your blood, and once in your blood, some of those molecules interact in the same way as taking prescription drugs. They affect the same biochemical pathways. So lavender, it makes you sleepier because it absolutely is affecting that biochemical pathway. It's not what your grandmother told you. I mean, she was right, basically. Actually, what I normally do at this point, I have some smells. I have some two smells that if you want to pass them around, you might take. I hate talking about smell and not actually having some smells. These are just essential oils, but they're the smells in there. But just to give an example of that, this is a lovely experiment where people basically, they walked in a forest. So here at the top here, the first one, this peak here, that's all you need to look at. When you take a measurement of the gas in the air and you measure it, that peak there is pinene. So the second one down, so the top one is they measured the air in the forest. They pulled in air in a pump and they put it across a GCMS machine and they saw this really high level of pinene. The second one is they measured the amount of pinene in the participants' bloods before they walked in the forest. And you can see here, this is tiny, it's down here. The third one is after they'd walked in the forest for 20 minutes, up here. So you can see that it really does start to move around your body, round in your blood at that point. So not only does it make you more relaxed, you get physiological and psychological calming. There are all sorts of other things making you sleepier. Rosemary makes you more awake, for example. That affects a particular pathway. Peppermint makes you more alert. Think about chewing gum. So all of these intuitive things that you start to think about. But the other thing I think is one of the most interesting from all of this for me is this one. And this is hinoki oil, and actually I've just sent round, it's not a hinoki, but it's in the same group, it's a cedar oil. And what they showed in this experiment was when they puffed it out in a hotel room, and the men were for 3 nights, after the third night of puffing it out, first of all, the men had significantly lower levels of the stress hormone adrenaline. So it does affect the endocrine pathway. But even more interesting, very, very statistically significant, they had elevated natural killer cells in their bloods. Now, natural killer cells are the cells that attack the cancer and virus cells in our bloods. We all want elevated levels of natural killer cells in our bloods. And this was an old experiment, and I've in the book there's a lot of work that's now being done where they've had people walking in cypress forests, cupressaceae forests, and then after walking there, they find they've got significantly elevated levels of natural killer cells. And they've also compared population groups that live in the forest or their houses are in the forest versus the nearby city, different levels of natural killer cells in their bloods. So if nothing else, I now puff this stuff out of my study once a week, just a bit of resilience building. But, you know, when I came across these studies, I thought, goodness. And so the most recent studies are published in journals like OncoTarget. They're cancer journals. So this is where it really does become, it's not just a sort of a feeling, it's something that's going on in our bodies. Right, let me move on then lastly to the environmental microbiome. And this, I think, is a really interesting, because this is another thing. We hear so much about drinking probiotic drinks, eating 30 plants a week to increase our gut microbiota. But actually, there's another way of doing that, because only 7% of our gut microbiota is inherited. The rest is driven by the environment around us. And this hypothesis came out about 12 years ago by a top ecologist and a top scientist, a surgeon in Finland. He just got lost. And they said in naturally occurring biodiverse environments, that, you get really good microbiota, the same sort that we want in our gut. And they hypothesized that spending time in nature increases microbiota in our bodies, and with a more diverse arsenal of these increased biodiversity, or increased microbiota, we would be better. Gradually, people have worked on this, and every single one of those hypotheses has been proven correct. And I want to give you one example where they've done a beautiful, this double-blinded, placebo-controlled, double-blinded test done and published in Science Advances 2 years ago. And they looked at kindergarten children in Finland. And they had three sand pits. And one of them they put in the sandpit soil from the local forest, and the other one was sterile, and the third one was matting. And they measured their gut flora, and they measured their bloods on days 1, 14, 28. And what did they find? They found that the children that played in the soil in the sandpit had a significant increase in their good skin and gut microbial diversity after 20 years. So, and this is the placebo group, and this is the group that played in the soil. And this in here are the T cells. So T cells in the blood are a really good indicator of enhanced immune system and inflammatory markers. And therefore, these children had reduced inflammatory markers in their bloods as a result, or linked through, they think, to this big change that was going on in their gut flora. So can we do this ourselves? Well, yes, because they looked at the difference of people who had a green wall, so that even a living green wall in the office versus no living green wall. Again, they found those after 20 days, those working in the green wall had a much higher abundance of good skin bacteria, but also in their bloods, a significant lowering of the inflammatory markers. So this is the sort of data that when you start to see it, you realize that the sort of nature and our interaction with nature, yes, we feel better and we have intuitive feelings about being nature, but there are also mechanisms of action that are going on that are really bringing about significant health benefits. But how much time do we need to spend in nature to do this? And I love this experiment, actually, because they basically took University of Michigan, got members of staff to get going on this over an 8-week period, and they measured their salivary amylase, which is an enzyme that's elevated when you're stressed. And they took measures at different, you do a 10-minute or 15-minute walk and measure salivary amylase. And what they found is that actually, so you've got 7 to 14, 15 to 20, 21 to 30, and more than 30. And they found actually the greatest drop, actually the one I've got up here is cortisol. We all know about cortisol. The greatest drop occurred after 20 minutes. When you did 30 minutes, you didn't really get much more of a drop. It sort of plateaus out. So if you're short of time, 20 minutes a few times a week is enough. But my favourite, I haven't shown it here, but my favourite result was that actually the greatest drop was when you sat and walked rather than ran. And so you don't have to be lycra clad to actually get those benefits. And to me, that's a big plus. What about the effectiveness of cost? Well, when they looked at cognitive behavioural therapy versus weekly sessions in the garden, what they found here was that when they compared the two, these were people who'd been off work for a year, and they compared their return rates to work, what they found is that they were the same. They were equally effective, but obviously one was much cheaper than the other. And then when they looked 12 months later, interestingly, that 77% of those who underwent the nature-based therapy were back at work, compared to 60 that did the cognitive behavioural therapy, which is the opposite to what I'd expected, because I thought cognitive behavioural therapy would be the thing that trained you to cope. But clearly the data shows something very different. And then finally, and I don't want to miss this out because I've talked very much about health, but what about staring out the window on your attention and your learning ability? Think how often we stare out a window. And what I became really clear of from looking at this data was staring out a window is actually really good for you. Most of all, it can be really good because it gives your focused attention a break, a mental mini break. So when you come back to the task in hand, you do better. Many experiments are now showing this. It's to do with the way that we look at nature, which is not really so focused. But this to me was, they found even 90 seconds will do. But the most important result, I think, of this is for children. So this was 3,000 school children. The results were published in Spain across 6 schools, about 8.5 years old. And they went 4 times, and they compared those that could see green from the window to those who couldn't. They took into account every socioeconomic factor going, plus what their parents did, etc., etc., etc. And none of them showed any relationship to the results coming through. The results showed that those that could see green from the window did better month on month in their school tests than those that couldn't. So just to stop now, and I've probably gone over 20 minutes, is that I think what we're saying is that, and what I've come about, I started off being a real cynic when I wrote this book, or started writing this book, or at least pulling together data. But by the end, I do believe that actually there's so many things we can do individually, but also in terms of society, to actually really embrace nature for the health benefits it provides. It reduces harm, that's for certain. I think it builds resilience, and also it restores our capacities, and all of those things, there's abundant evidence for it, but we now need to get that into much more of a framing that's similar to the framing used for medicine, whereas right now a lot of our interactions with nature, or discussions about nature and health, are very much at a much more sort of loose end of the discussion, where politicians think it can just be moved outside of cities because it's not relevant. So I will stop at that point, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Sitting here? Yeah. Long way up. Oh, and it moves. Okay.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? I don't know if it's actually on. Oh, sorry, press the on button. I'm not a scientist, but I worked that out. Thank you so much, Kathy. That was such a rich and detailed talk. I'm just going to spend probably about 15 minutes just asking you a few questions of mine, and then we'll hand over to the audience. So do start brewing questions of your own. I wanted to start by asking about, so disclosure, I am not a scientist. I'm coming from a kind of literary, sociological, cultural background. So my first question is a kind of writerly question about the way that you open the book.
Yeah.
Because you begin very much as, you know, the expert, the scientist, and approaching the subject from a research perspective. And then we begin to get more of an insight into how you feel about these questions, and specifically the experience of working at Kew and spending time with plants as plants themselves rather than as Latin names and kind of research topics. So yeah, I'd love to know a little bit about how writing this book kind of made you feel connected to the subject.
Well, it's very funny. So I think I say in the book at the beginning, I started my life as a paleoecologist, which is effectively using fossil pollen and plant macrofossils to reconstruct vegetational histories and understand responses of plants to vegetation over time, with drivers of climate change, for example. So I spent a lot of time just staring down a microscope at things that are long since dead. And then I moved on much more to sort of policy stuff, but that again, you're just looking at academic papers and even in Kew, actually, herbarium specimens, beautiful, but, you know, flat, squashed plants, effectively. But then it was quite interesting because I did start to also, I had a wonderful office at Kew where I looked out onto the garden and I'd observe people touching plants or smelling them or ignoring any of the keep off the grass signs and things. And I used to go walking at lunchtime. It was a very, very busy job. Kew has 400 scientists, or it did at that time, and I was managing those and all the collections. So it was a pretty full-on job. And I would go walking at lunchtime, excuse me, either around the gardens or I'd walk into Kew Village. And I started to notice that once, if I walked around the garden, by the time I came back, I was much, much happier and much calmer than if I'd stomped up to Tesco's and back to buy a sandwich. And so that was also, once I started to look at this stuff, I thought, gosh, I'd never really given it any thought about that behavior that I was sort of intuitively following through. And I changed, and writing the book, and I mean, if Bloomsbury, the editor, would be laughing slightly, I was pulled screaming and kicking into actually starting to bring myself into the book, because I'd always written as a scientist, you know, this experiment was done and this happened or whatever. And it was suddenly you start to realize that your whole personality and your own actions are changing. My house has changed as a result of buying this book. My study is full of plants. Everywhere in the house there are plants.
That's amazing. And that idea as well of the expert, because I've written on this subject as well, and people, when they know you're writing about the subject, say, oh, I really want to have a stronger relationship with nature, but I don't know the names of birds, or I don't know, you know, the specific trees, and can I be included as well? You know, is it for me?
I think that's such an important thing as well. You don't need to, I no longer care about what the species is, or when I go and buy something, I'll be looking at what's the shape of the leaf, what's its color, what makes me happy, which smell do I like. And I think that the more we can actually appreciate, and it's even with birds as well, the more things that the more you read about this, you don't need to know the finite details to actually enjoy, but also get the health benefits from nature. And I think that's something that scientists have to be really careful of, that they don't end up sort of just talk to each other because they're the only ones that have that language.
And in the book, the book is called Good Nature, so there's a focus on beneficial nature. But in your wider research, I know you've touched on kind of less beneficial relations, maybe with mosquitoes.
Yes. So, the work we do in the lab, we do two things. One is on looking at, obviously, good nature, and particularly the smell. I've had students sitting in the glass houses in the Botanic Gardens in Oxford for 20 minutes to see whether or not different smellscapes do bring about different physiological and psychological. So if it's pouring with rain, can you go and sit in a glass house? Well, that's the sort of the ultimate, and yes, you can, but that's giving away the data. But the other half of that is mosquitoes, because mosquitoes, most people, I didn't know anyway, is that mosquitoes are nectar feeders, and it's only the female mosquito that takes a blood meal once she's mated. And therefore, what is the relationship between mosquitoes and the plants on a landscape? And particularly being able to understand how much nectar is available on a landscape for the mosquitoes, because that's a direct relationship then to how effective things like traps are and baits are.
I mean, for people who are kind of interested in how human health and particularly well-being fits within wider ecological questions, there's always that risk. It's like when people want to protect species and they're more interested in protecting the pretty panda than the ugly fish at the bottom of the ocean that they don't have a relationship with. So as a scientist, do you feel that responsibility for saying, okay, these things make us feel good, but we do need the whole spectrum of nature to be well?
Yes, I mean, I think it's an interesting, that the whole relationship between sort of valuing nature for the benefits it provides to us, the one species, and these multiple species. I think all parts of the ecosystem need to work in order to provide this. And so I think it is a great believer, and a lot of the work we do is about the relationship between the different aspects of nature. You can't have flourishing nature unless you've got good soils, unless you've got the pollinators. And so it's all the moving parts that make this work. But when you're thinking about the relationship between health and nature, it's very clear that if you're particularly thinking about nature indoors, you don't need the whole ecosystem. You just need to know, if you're going to have things on your desk, what should you have on your desk to get the maximum benefit that you can from nature.
Yeah, and that is quite significant when you're thinking about images of nature as well.
Yes.
So you can have so I was involved in I was basically a guinea pig on a study that was done at Bristol University, and it was to try to work out the importance of the non-visual senses in like an interior space, like a hospital. What would pipe bird song do? You know, what would the smell do for people who might not be able to go outside? And as we were waiting to go in, there was a very cynical geographer who was like, I hate this kind of thing, it's got to be the real thing. And there was a big kind of floor to ceiling picture they'd put on the wall of a pine forest, and everyone was saying, oh, how beautiful. And he said, that's an industrial pine forest. That's not a beautiful, flourishing rainforest. That's industrial forestry. So how important do you think it is that these kind of interventions support nature's own flourishing? Or do you think that's kind of not a relevant question?
I think it's, if I take it another way, so the reaction to, I hate that picture. So what I've come clear of, and a lot of the things that are going on are automatic. So your hormone system changes automatically. Your heart rate variability, your autonomic nervous system changes automatically. And so he might say, I hate that picture because it's industrial forest, but actually looking at it, it probably did calm him down a bit.
It didn't feel like it.
It might not have felt like it. And I think I tend to partition nature now much more, because I think if you're coming at it from a policy focus, or how on earth are we going to improve global health, when you think it's 70 or 80% people, now the highest death rate is from non-communicable diseases, and these are vast majority of them are stress related. How do we really start to think about how we're going to bring all these things in? Then I think I tend to think of nature as rather differently, more as a sort of in cities, how do we ensure that everyone has this access to green space and nature?
Yeah, that's really the question I wanted to kind of pose next, is what do we do with this, or what should be done with this at the level of policy? Because this research, there's a good, strong, well-developed evidence base. And even in 2015, a group of so the Wildlife Trust and RSPB got together with University of Exeter, who've done a lot of work in this area, to try to bring in a Nature and Wellbeing Act, which would have made nature accessible in schools, in hospitals, to build it into the planning system to make sure that everybody did have access. It's the same kind of conversation we're having now, 10 years ago. So why do you think there's such a lag at that policy level?
Because I think nature is always viewed it is still viewed predominantly as the fluffy bunnies, pretty flowers, and therefore actually the best thing we can do for nature is to concrete over it in cities and move nature outside into the countryside. So the link between humans and nature is just not, in terms of our well-being, is not there. And I'm afraid policy is absolutely heading that way again with the urban infrastructure bill. But, and it's almost like, one should not be arguing about nature in cities because we need houses. And so my view is nature needs to be viewed like an infrastructure. We need to think, okay, this is where we're going to have the houses. This is where we're going to have the nature. This is where we're going to have the electricity and all the other things we need. Because without actually actively thinking about how to incorporate nature into cities, we're not. It's just not going to happen. It'll go the opposite way.
Yeah, and that sort of it raises questions, doesn't it, when you start thinking about why these environments aren't working?
Yeah.
About maybe why some of the social structures aren't working as well. I always find it fascinating to think about forest bathing. It sounds like this ancient practice, but actually it was invented in Japan, and
it's a marketing thing. Yeah.
Right, in response to a massive suicide crisis in the business sector, people massively overworking, and illnesses that kind of come from that level of overwork as well, like heart disease and strokes. Yeah. And it is essentially a way of trying to make people kind of responsible for taking care of themselves outside of work without changing business culture, right? Those hours remain long. So yeah, how much when you sort of start working in this area at the level you are, do you become critical of those social and political structures as well as the kind of lack of nature as a?
Well, I think that it's easier to bring nature in and actually than try and change a social and political structure. So I think go for the easy, low-hanging fruit, if I can guess. And once you start to talk to people about these things and they start to see the evidence base, more often than not, people come back and say, well, I've got a spider plant on my desk now, or I've done this or I've done that. It's small things, but small things, if they spread out across an office environment or a different, you gradually. So I do I've been talking a lot with the National Health Service now. Now they're not going to bring plants into wards anytime soon, but they are thinking about actually views from hospital windows. They are they're doing some fantastic stuff in terms of hospital gardens and what they're bringing in. So, and so then you can think of all these different parts of life where people have talked to me about prisons. Can we start to have small social gardens and things in prisons, or at least some views that aren't just brick walls? Schools, we talk a lot in schools about how we're going to mitigate against climate change by putting up big shade things, but those shade things that we're putting in our schools right now are big sort of pieces of linen on stainless steel posts. Why don't we put some trees there? It's just thinking about how can we stack the benefits? How can we really bring about these changes?
And seeing human health and ecological flourishing as actually massively interlinked, because obviously the evolutionary story is that they are.
Yes, it is. No, absolutely. Absolutely.
I wonder at this point if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. Oh, yes, you do. Thank you. I think there's a mic coming around.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I'm a doctor. And that's one of the things I noticed in the NHS. I remember, is like 5-6 years ago. I was just a junior doctor, and we had this new ward, and they were very proud to show us the new ward. And the windows for the patient's bed were frosted so for patient privacy.
Yeah.
But I was like, but they can't get the light. They can't
Yes.
see out the window.
Yes.
It's going to be like they're trapped in. And I think it's really nice that we have these studies now that show that actually looking out the window is really important. You get a bit of sunlight, you can see the greenery, you can see the skies. Even if it's grey, you still get to look out at something. And that, saying these studies that show that your immunity is boosted by that is really important, I think, because I think some of it is common sense, but when you
Yes.
have the study, then you can back it up and be
Yes.
like, this is really important. And then I went to a different hospital where during COVID times, they took out some of the green space. And that place had a green space, it had a fountain and lots
Yeah.
of trees and flowers and stuff, which was lovely for healthcare professionals,
Yeah.
but for the patients as well. So we just go out and sit there. And they took some of that green space to build more wards and stuff for the patients. And so it was really sad.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the important thing. It's providing the evidence base to actually, because more often than not, the policies are driven by the evidence base. So it's showing that there is an evidence base. It's, I'm sure everyone in this room thinks, well, intuitively, I know most of this, but it's actually showing that there are mechanisms of action that are triggered when we do this thing, and therefore there is a clear evidence base coming through, which makes it much more powerful in that space.
Thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Okay, we'll go to the front there.
Hi, I very much believe in nature and health and well-being. I work as a health coach and a meditation teacher as well. Couple of questions, if I can ask.
Yes, of course, yes.
So with nature, does it have to be trees? Because I find maybe if some people don't have access to trees, if they're living in a city, would nature be looking at the sky? Would that be enough or not if for people they don't have access to places that there have many trees? Because we do have many, but sometimes you may not be very close to park. And another question was, does it matter in what season you are also looking at the trees? Would spring be better than summer?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
Or autumn? Because I love walking, and I think bringing in the mindfulness and meditation. When you walk, you see every tree, and I see the same trees, and I see them, change with the seasons as well. And I see it bring joy to me, relaxation to me, calmness to me, and also guiding my clients to do the same. I'm seeing it, bringing it to them, where they're saying, now I'm seeing something I may not have seen. So the seasons with the plants and the trees, but what about just looking at the sky?
So I don't know about looking at the sky. I certainly know that, first of all, absolutely doesn't have to be trees. And a lot of the studies, particularly on indoors, are shown that, as I keep talking about spider plants because I love spider plants because you can't kill them, they multiply, and they're really good. They even seed the air with a fantastic microbiome. So the more spider plants one can have, the better. So there are good things you have on your desk. I don't know about the sky. I certainly know that different bird sounds are really, really important. And so, people walking with their headphones on, clamped to their ears in the park, and you think, just stop and listen. So certainly tuneful bird songs like the robin, those ones that have got a sort of a repeated pattern, they're shown to absolutely bring about physiological and psychological calming. You get that really hard squawk that you get from parrots, and the parakeets do the opposite. People's stress levels go up. So we want to be careful what we're listening to. But interestingly, actually, when they've shown in hospitals, and it comes back to the medics in the room, that they've had these things where people have worn headphones when they're having an operation with an epidural, that they do salivary amylase, look at their stress levels, and they do pain score. And if people hear tuneful birdsong and water, they have much lower pain score, and they're much less stressed than no sound or hearing the sound in the hospital. So there are all these layer things. But coming back to the seasons, of course, you might not have the colour, but you've got the fractal patterns that you're still seeing of trees, and so there does still seem to be very good calming even in the winter. And I don't know if there's very little work done on it, but this is something we're looking at. When you walk in a forest in the winter, you get a very distinctive smell. So that smell's not coming from the trees, it's coming from the soil. And it's the fungal the fungi give off a volatile, and it'd be really interesting to know whether or not that is a volatile that does trigger very positive actions in the body, because I think many of the fungi, the good fungi, do, although pathogenic fungi have a separate profile, so it's also a very interesting dimension.
It's not. Is it petrichor? Oh, yeah, you say it properly.
Yes, that's one of them. But yeah.
So there's a question at the back. Well, Lily's on it. Yeah, trust Lily.
I found this talk so inspiring. Thank you so much. I live in London and I moved into a flat that overlooks a park. And the day I moved in, I cried my eyes out because I could hear the birds in the morning and I could see the trees, and it's made a massive difference to my life. So really resonated. I've got two questions as well. One of them is you didn't talk so much about touch.
Yes.
Does that, like, I'm thinking about hugging trees.
Yes.
Does that have an impact?
There's a chapter in the book called Tree Hugging.
Okay.
It does. I mean, there's not so much evidence on that, and whenever I've talked about it, if you're not careful, you immediately get labelled as a tree hugger, which I have been. So but certainly stroking sort of unvarnished wood and stuff. They've done studies where they've compared that to stroking same temperature marble and aluminium, and you have much lower blood pressure when you're doing that.
Interesting.
And actually, once you realise that, next time you go to sort of something like B&Q and look, and what do most people do the first time they walk into the sort of the kitchen area? They're stroking the surface, and it's amazing how many people you see then. If you see a wooden surface, they sort of stroke it, and it's that comes back to that sort of, there's something we automatically do, but also touching plants, green leaves in particular, seems to, again, and they've done some lovely experiments doing children working with plants and other things, and again showing them much calmer when they're touching the leaves and playing with the plants in experiments than a computer brain looking at plants or other activities like playing with a ball.
Yeah, thank you. My second question was, I love plants, but I'm the worst gardener in the world. I kill them.
I'm in that category. I just find plant a new one. Yeah.
I just wondered if you had any top tips of the best kind of plants that survive,
to survive
terrible gardeners.
Well, I'm pretty good with sort of geraniums, actually. You can't, geraniaceae, that whole family seems to be pretty resilient to bad gardening.
Okay. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you so much. It was really inspiring and interesting. I work for Nattergal, a nature restoration company, and we're really intent on working with our local communities, including like demonstrating the health benefits and mental health benefits of bringing people to our rewilding sites. And my question is, what do you think we can do to help the NHS understand the importance of green social prescribing as a way to, over the long term, decrease costs related to healthcare, for example?
Yeah.
And do you have any examples?
Well, it's a really, really good question. And that's where I'd say that's the biggest knowledge gap. So the example I gave you there from Copenhagen, that's Copenhagen University example. And I can think about 4 others that have been carried out in this country where they've looked at the cost benefits, and they've taken one particular treatment, and it's been a proper clinical study to say which one is most effective. And I think that is how we're going to bring about the change, because when people start to see that actually there is a significant cost benefit to be had, that is when obviously the much greatly cash-strapped health service will start to really listen to this. But I also think it comes back to teaching as well. So my daughter's a medic, but she's much more junior than you. She's only just finished, but she didn't have a single lecture in her 6 years about health and nature, not a single discussion. So it needs to be something, it needs to also be built into that education system. And that's where things like the rewilded sites are so important, because actually people will go to those sites out of interest, they'll go there for recreation. And so communication from these sorts of sites are absolutely critical. And interestingly, think about the rewilded sites. I mean, I am a big fan of them, but also there was a lovely study done on rewilded sites and the microbiome and actually healthy guts, and really, really strong link. So there are so many benefits from things, and they can be used as examples, but also the education part of that to me is a really important thing.
Question at the back there.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting stuff. I work as a clinical psychologist and a lot with kind of trauma people. And like the grounding with the five senses is something I use quite a lot. And I never knew there was so much research in each individual grounding. But I think, as human beings, we weren't designed to be in big concrete cities.
Yeah.
And I think I really like the idea of this kind of passiveness around having green space around us that it actually subconsciously and gets through biologically to actually affect us in a positive way. And working with clients, like all of my clients have mental health problems, most of them, but it's really, can they be safe in their nervous system or unsafe? And when the more unsafe they get up on that scale, the more disconnected they become from their environment.
Yeah.
And that's why CBT wouldn't work for a client who's traumatized with me, because I'd need to ground them first to be in touch with, or that part of their brain isn't going to be processing anything. Yeah. So I think, I think this is really important research, but also that, and combined with actually keeping our nervous systems calm, because if our nervous systems in cities are on kind of, fight or flight, but not kind of mental health fight or flight, it's taking energy from all our other systems, and it's making us, more sick. So I think things like greener cities, greener workspaces, all of this sort of stuff is huge. And of course, social subscribing and stuff is great, but that's more of an active thing where people, because just I used to work in a ward in a high secure psychiatric hospital, and we were designing a therapeutic milieu based on behavioral and CBT to try and, but it was missing the fact that a lot of these people are heavily traumatized and dissociating like mad. So the CBT stuff's just bouncing off, and we're wondering why they're incurable psychopaths if they can't properly engage. But with this sort of thing, calm people down so they're better able to get into the calm part of the nervous system, empathize, perspective take, connect to themselves and their bodies more, rather than doing to strive, apart from kind of being with kind of nature as we were supposed to be. I
couldn't agree with you more, and I think it's it's an area crying out for more research. I mean, they've done some work on schizophrenic people who've got schizophrenia, and actually the benefit of having green, and particularly actually with schizophrenics, it's autumn colours as well are really it seems to calm people down significantly. So I think there's huge potential here, and it's getting, but as I say at the beginning, it's getting people, it's getting the whole mindset about nature beyond it's just a really pretty stuff and over there somewhere, to actually how do we make sure that even in our own lives we have nature, that we're touching nature, we're seeing it, we're smelling it every day, in order to build that resilience and to add the calming. And where I disagree with some of the prescribing nature is the idea you go out and you're aware of nature around you and that will make you calmer. It might, but it might make you really irritated, because you feel that I'm out here, I must be calmer because I'm in nature. So we have to be really careful that doesn't in itself become. What I like about, or what I've really found inspiring about the research, is that these reactions happen automatically. You don't have to persuade someone who's feeling really stressed, you need to go into nature, it'll make you feel better. Because if someone says that to me and I'm feeling really cross, believe you me, it doesn't. So it's sort of, so, and I think that's what you're saying is a sort of much, much further down that pathway of actually, it's how do we ensure that people are listening to this thing, that it's really important to have even small bits of small patches of nature wherever we are, in order to bring about these benefits. Yeah,
absolutely.
It's so complicated, isn't it? Because obviously people who live in the countryside also suffer from mental health problems.
Well, I'm interested. I think a study that's crying out to be looked at right now is whether or not those mental health problems are related to, if you look at, you can be in the countryside and yet you're in a field or a landscape that's completely devoid of shape. It's a single colour. It has none of the benefits, no smell, and it's full of chemicals. So I mean, are we surprised? So we have people say, well, 90% of the UK is countryside. Yes, but how much of that really is nature that is actually healthy or healthy for us? And we tend to sort of put it in. So I think it'd be very interesting to look at if there are pockets, and there are pockets of significant depression amongst farmers, and can you use those in the same way that these big population level studies being done in cities, to understand are there particular aspects of that green space that's leading to those higher levels of mental health problems in those areas? I mean, it's sort of crying out to be done.
Yeah, the difference between green space as just an aesthetic and actually a biodiverse
Yes,
environment.
yeah, there's green space and green space.
Okay, well, I just want to talk to Kathy now. No, we've got a few more minutes for questions, maybe. Yeah, head one at the front.
Hi, I had a couple of questions. First of all, were there any differences in how different genders responded to nature? And then secondly, did you have any numbers on how much time people spent in nature 50 years ago versus today, just to try and understand that diminution?
So both really interesting questions. The first one on gender, which I think is a really interesting one, is actually the number of trees that you see on a horizon. So what they've shown is that actually if there are too many trees, they show that that's when women get more stressed, which is not surprising. If you've got a really dense forest, I don't know about how many other women in this room, but I'm not going to go stomping through a dense forest. And so it's this whole flight or fight reaction. And so they found there was a gender difference in that there gets to a particular point where in sort of a, I'm going like this because it's like in a field of vision, that you get too many trees and you'll find that women get more, their stress levels go up rather than down. So that's also really important for city planners. It's great to put loads of trees in cities, but don't put too many. So that would be, so it comes back to, I'm sorry, what was your second question? Oh, yeah. Well, that's a really, I don't know if anyone's looked at that, but it really would be worth looking at. My gut feeling is that 50 years ago, we would have been outdoors more than now. And certainly if I look at my mother's generation, of course, there's sort of, a lot of people had allotments and were generally out in the garden. They were growing a lot more. Certainly, I grew up in London, but even in London, we was, always out rather than indoors. But as I think this is one of the, as we've got more and more into the, sort of from the 1960s onwards, you can see the whole designs of buildings have become more and more angular, less and less plants, people more and more focused on computers. And we've sort of lost that interaction that we even, because if you look at Victorian houses and parlour palms, they're full of plants, and gradually plants disappeared from the houses. Yes?
Because if you look at the 35 to 45 year,
yes,
particularly male, I think much greater instances of cancer than ever before. And I was wondering perhaps there'd been any work done on.
Not that I'm aware of, but the most interesting study I think is this one that was published a couple of years ago in Oncotarget, where they just looked at people whose houses, there was a big university study, so they had like 90 couples that lived in houses around the edges of or in the forest, and then the other 100 odd who lived outside. Really big difference in natural killer cells.
In the interests of keeping to time, I'm going to have to close the conversation now. Hopefully you have questions you can ask Kathy while you're buying her book, which is available over there.
Not you.
If I could be super cheeky and just ask like maybe a one answer question, if there was somebody that you would really love to read this book in a position of power, who would it be?
Keir Starmer.
Okay. Okay, anybody got links to Keir Starmer? Get the book to Keir Starmer. Thank you so much for an amazing talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.